She hadn't seen a sunrise in 11 years, but the morning they brought that horse to her gate, a black stallion so wild they'd hauled him in a reinforced trailer with 3 men just to hold the ropes, she stepped off her porch, turned her face toward the sound of hooves hammering against steel walls, and said one thing: "He's scared, just like me." Nobody believed she could handle him. Nobody believed she could handle anything anymore. The ranch was falling apart. The neighbors had stopped calling. The bank had sent its 3rd letter. And here was this woman, blind, widowed, alone on 40 acres of cracked red earth, reaching through the rails of a fence she navigated by memory toward an animal that had already put 2 experienced wranglers in the hospital. What happened next, no one in that county has ever fully explained. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been written off by the people who were supposed to know better? A doctor, a banker, a neighbor, someone who looked at your situation and decided, without asking, that you were already done. Because this story is about exactly that. And what happens when one woman, with no sight and no backup, refuses to accept someone else's ending for her life? If you've ever felt invisible to the world around you, leave your city in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from, and if this kind of story moves you, hit like and subscribe, because we tell these every week, and they're always real. Now, let me tell you about Maisie Calloway, the blind widow of the old Calloway Ranch, and the horse they said would kill her. The land had belonged to the Calloway family for 3 generations. Maisie's grandfather had broken it himself, 60 years before she was born, pulling roots out of that hard Texas clay with a team of mules and a stubbornness that became something of a local legend. Her father had expanded it, added the barn, the bunkhouse, the long cedar fence that ran along the highway. And her husband, Leland Calloway, had kept it all alive through drought and collapse and the particular brand of quiet catastrophe that comes with farming in a century that no longer values farmers. Leland died on a Tuesday in October, 4 years before this story begins. Heart attack, out by the east pasture. He was 56 years old and had never been sick a day in his life, which made it worse somehow, the total absence of warning. Maisie had been in the kitchen when it happened. She didn't know for 3 hours. By then it was already over. She had lost her sight 2 years before that, which meant she'd had 2 years of navigating the ranch blind with Leland beside her, learning the distances, the sounds, the specific creak of each gate. She memorized the number of steps from the back door to the water trough, 22. From the porch railing to the barn, 41 if she walked straight and didn't drift left. She knew the chickens by their voices and the cattle by the weight of their footfalls on the morning ground. When Leland died, people assumed she would leave. She did not leave. What she did instead was grieve, in the most private and practical way a person can grieve, by learning to do everything he had done, entirely by feel, entirely alone, in a landscape she could no longer see, but could still, somehow, know. She hired one hand the first year, a young man named Brock who quit in March after deciding the whole situation made him too uncomfortable. She hired another, a woman named Elise, who lasted longer, almost 8 months, before her own family circumstances pulled her away. After that, Maisie stopped hiring. She told her sister, Rowan, who called every Sunday from Amarillo, that she'd figured out what she needed to figure out. Rowan didn't believe her. The bank didn't believe her. The Cattlemen's Association rep who drove out to check on the property didn't believe her either. He wrote in his notes that the ranch was in adequate condition given the circumstances, which everyone who read it understood to mean, given that a blind widow is running it alone. The county extension office sent a brochure about assisted living. Maisie used it to start a fire in the wood stove. But the truth, if you pressed it, and this is the part the story requires honesty about, is that the ranch was struggling. The east fence had come down in a windstorm, and she hadn't been able to fix it right. 2 of her 3 remaining cattle had wandered and never come back. The well pump was making a sound she didn't like, a low metallic groaning that happened at 6 a.m. and again at dusk. She had about 4 months of savings left, maybe 5 if she cut back on feed. She was not beaten, but she was close to a line that once crossed doesn't uncross easily. That was the fall the state's wild horse adoption program came to her county. A neighboring rancher, a man named Purcell, had volunteered his facility as a temporary holding station. They'd brought 17 horses down from the northern ranges, Mustangs, most of them, with a few feral ranch escapees mixed in. 16 of them had been spoken for by the time the program coordinator, a calm-voiced woman named Deja, drove out to see Maisie. The 17th had not been spoken for because nobody wanted him. His name in the program's file was simply 4Fee4. The wranglers had started calling him Ash because of the color of his coat in certain light, not quite black, not quite gray, somewhere in between, like something burned that hadn't cooled yet. He was 5 years old, estimated, and in those 5 years he had apparently made every human who approached him regret it. Deja had not planned to offer him to Maisie Calloway, but she'd heard about the ranch, about the situation, and she'd thought, in a moment of either inspiration or poor judgment, she wasn't sure which, that maybe an unconventional problem deserved an unconventional solution. She drove out on a Wednesday morning. Maisie made coffee and listened to the whole proposal without interrupting. When Deja finished, there was a long silence. "What does he sound like?" Maisie asked. Deja blinked. "What does he sound like? When they bring him in? What does he do? Does he scream? Does he go quiet? Does he kick or does he rear?" Deja thought about it. "He goes very still," she said finally. "And then he explodes." Maisie nodded slowly, both hands around her coffee mug. "That's not a mean horse," she said. "That's a terrified one." They brought Ash to the ranch on a Friday. Maisie had spent the 2 days between Deja's visit and the horse's arrival doing what she always did when facing something large and uncertain. She prepared the space. She walked the paddock 17 times in a row, not counting, just walking, until she had its dimensions in her legs and not just her memory. She found the 2 places where the fence rail was loose and fixed them by feel, her hands reading the wood grain the way a doctor reads a pulse. She moved the water trough 18 inches to the left so there was a clear center corridor through the paddock, nothing to crowd him. She talked to herself the whole time, not nervously, just noting things out loud, the way she'd learned to do after the blindness set in, as a form of spatial record-keeping. Rail is good here. Post has a wobble, check tomorrow. Gate swings clean, good. Rowan called Thursday night, and Maisie told her what was coming. There was a silence on the line that said everything Rowan didn't say out loud. "You can't see him, Maisie." "I know that. What if he charges you? Then I'll hear him coming." "That's not—" Rowan stopped, started again. "Horses are fast, Maisie. I've been living with horses my whole life. With your eyes." Another silence. This one different. "Rowan," Maisie said quietly, "I know what you're worried about, but I need you to let me try this. If it doesn't work, I'll tell you. I promise I'll tell you." Rowan said she'd drive down the following weekend to check in. Maisie said that would be fine. The trailer came at 7 in the morning. 3 men from Purcell's facility, a wiry older man named Cassius, and 2 younger ones who didn't give their names. Maisie stood at the paddock gate while they worked. She heard everything. The trailer door, the ramp, the specific rhythm of hooves on metal, then on packed earth. She heard Ash stop. "He's looking at you," Cassius said from somewhere to her right. "I know," she said. She hadn't moved. The horse didn't move either. She could hear his breathing, fast at first, ragged, the breath of an animal in high alert. She waited. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak. She just stood at the gate in the early morning cold and let him hear her breath too. It took 4 minutes, she counted by the slow internal rhythm she'd developed over years of patient work, before his breathing started to even out. The men got the halter off him and backed out of the paddock. The gate latched. Ash was loose in the enclosure. "You sure you're all right?" Cassius asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for bringing him." After they left, she stood there another 20 minutes. Not moving toward the horse, not moving away, just being present. She could track him around the paddock by sound, the weight of him, the way the ground absorbed his steps, the occasional sharp exhale when he came too close to something and scared himself. Around the 20-minute mark, she heard him stop, closer than before, maybe 15 feet. She took one slow step back and went inside to make breakfast. The first week was a study in patience that bordered on spiritual practice. She went to the paddock fence 5 times a day. Morning, midday, mid-afternoon, evening, and once just before bed. Each time she brought something, apple slices, a handful of dried grass from the field, once just her hands and nothing else. She never entered the paddock those first 5 days. She stood at the rail and talked. Not to Ash, exactly. Or not only to Ash. She talked the way some people talk when they're alone, conversationally, to no one fixed, covering whatever was on her mind, the weather, the state of the east pasture. Something Rowan had said on Sunday. The strange satisfaction of mending a fence correctly by touch, the smell of coming rain. She'd learned, during the early years of her blindness, that animals responded more to voice cadence than content. It wasn't what you said, it was the texture of saying it, the pace, the ease, the absence of forced emotion. Anxiety traveled in the voice faster than any other signal, and animals received it like a broadcast. So she kept her voice the way she kept her hands, loose, deliberate, unhurried. On the 6th day, she entered the paddock. She went in at mid-morning when the air was still and the horse was in the northeast corner. She could tell by the quiet. And she walked to the center of the space and stopped. She was inside his territory now. She expected him to move. He did. She heard the quick repositioning, the shuffle of hooves, the displacement of air that told her he'd crossed to the southwest. She turned her face in that direction. They stayed like that for 11 minutes. Then she heard something that surprised her. He came closer, not all the way. He stopped at what she estimated was 8 feet and stood there, breathing. She could feel the warmth of him on the air, the particular atmospheric pressure of a large animal at close range, something that only the sightless, perhaps, ever really learned to detect. He smelled like dry grass and old sweat, and something wilder underneath that she had no word for. "I know," she said very quietly. "It's a lot to take in." He exhaled, a long, low sound, not quite a snort. She waited. He came one step closer. That was the 6th day. By day 9, he was taking apple slices from her palm. Not calmly, he snatched them and retreated each time like a child stealing cookies, but he was taking them, and that was different from running. On day 12, she rested her hand on his neck for approximately 3 seconds before he moved away. She didn't follow. She put her hand down and stood still and let him decide what the contact meant. On day 14, she put her hand on his neck, and he didn't move away. She stood there for a long time with her palm against his coat, feeling his heartbeat slow. Outside the paddock, the world had its own opinions. Purcell stopped by on day 10, ostensibly to drop off some feed he said the program had covered. Maisie suspected the real reason was to see what disaster had unfolded. She heard him at the fence line, heard his low whistle of surprise. "He's not killing you," Purcell observed. "No," she said. "Huh?" A pause. "He let you touch him." "Some." Another pause. Longer. "That's more than he let anyone at my place do in 3 weeks." She didn't say anything to that. Deja called on day 12, professional concern wrapped in genuine curiosity. Maisie gave her an honest report. Deja was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I ask what you're doing differently?" Maisie thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "I think that's the point." Day 16 brought the first real test, and it came from outside the paddock. A truck backfired on the county road, sharp, loud, right at the moment Maisie was in the paddock, adjusting the water trough. She heard Ash react before she could register the sound properly. A thunderclap of hooves on hard dirt, a rush of displaced air, and then 230 pounds of panicked horse shoulder charging into her left side. She went down hard, hip on the ground, elbow. She heard herself cry out, a sharp, involuntary sound. The horse kept moving, arced away to the far fence, and she heard him pacing, back and forth, tight, fast, hyperventilating. She lay still for a moment, doing her own assessment. Hip bruised, elbow scraped, shoulder strained, nothing broken. She took 3 slow breaths. Then she sat up. She did not leave the paddock. This was instinct more than decision. She understood somewhere below, thought that leaving now in fear would set a different kind of precedent. So she sat on the ground in the middle of the paddock and listened to the horse pace and waited for him to stop. He stopped after about 4 minutes. She heard him approach, slower this time, different from his earlier tentative approaches. Something in his gait was lower, more careful, and she thought, he knows. Not fully, not the way a person knows, but there was something in his return that felt different from panic and different from hunger. He came to within 2 feet and stopped. She reached her hand out, knuckles up, never palm, with a nervous animal. You offer the back of the hand first, and she waited. His muzzle touched her knuckles, warm, dry, extraordinarily soft, the way horse noses are, that texture that always surprised people who'd never felt it. She sat on the ground in the paddock in the cool November air with the horse's nose on her knuckles and cried, not dramatically, not with any performance to it, just the quiet running over of something that had been very full for a very long time. Word got around the way it does in small counties. The story, as it traveled, picked up distortions. Some people said she'd tamed the horse in a week. Some said it was some kind of intuition that came with blindness, a sixth sense, something supernatural. A man at the feed store told his customers she'd been speaking to the horse in a language no one else could hear. None of that was true. What was true was harder to explain and less dramatic. A woman who had learned through years of navigating a world without sight to be still in a way that most people never are. Because most people never have to be. No phone to check. No constant visual input pulling the mind forward and sideways. Just presence. Just the specific gravity of now. The bank sent another letter. She read it by running her fingers over the raised print of the envelope. She knew bank envelopes by shape and weight by now, and set it on the kitchen table. The following Monday, a local reporter named Gideon— wait, no. The names from before couldn't be used. A local reporter named Sterling called her to ask if he could come by. Someone had tipped him about the horse. She said she'd think about it and called Deja. Let him come, Deja said. Maisie, you need the ranch to survive. Let him come. Sterling arrived with a photographer named Yolanda and a voice recorder he kept apologizing for. Maisie found him likable in a slightly fumbling way. Eager, but not pushy. The kind of person who'd been raised to talk to elderly relatives at holidays and had thus developed a skill for bridging silences. He walked with her to the paddock and watched Ash for a long time without saying anything. Then, he's beautiful. I believe you, she said. He turned to look at her. She could tell by the shift in his voice. Is it? You can ask, she said. Carefully, but you can ask. Does it bother you, not being able to see him? She considered this with her full attention, which was the only way she ever considered things. There are parts of him I know better than you do, she said. The rhythm of his breathing when he's afraid versus when he's calm. The specific vibration of his hooves when he's coming to me versus moving away from something. I know the heat of him at different hours of the day. She paused. I don't know his color. I don't know what he looks like against the sky. That's real, and I don't want to be false about it. But I wonder sometimes if what I have is different from nothing. Sterling's article ran the following Thursday in the county paper. Yolanda's photograph. Ash with his nose resting on Maisie's shoulder, Maisie's face tilted slightly upward, as if listening to something no one else could hear, was picked up by 2 regional outlets and then by a national platform that aggregated human interest stories. Maisie didn't know any of this. She didn't own a computer, and her phone was a basic model with large buttons that Rowan had ordered for her years ago. What she knew was that her landline started ringing on Friday morning and didn't really stop. Rowan drove down Saturday, earlier than planned, and walked around the ranch with the stunned expression of someone discovering that the burning building had somehow become a garden. There's a woman from a horse training magazine, Rowan said, standing in the kitchen looking at the notepad Maisie had been using to keep track of calls. "There's someone who wants to make a documentary. There's a man named—" "I know," Maisie said. "Maisie, I know. This could save the ranch." "I know that too." Rowan sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and Maisie heard in her sister's breathing the particular texture of tears being held back. "You stubborn woman," Rowan said. Her voice was breaking and laughing at the same time. "You absolutely stubborn woman." Maisie reached across the table until she found Rowan's hand. "I told you I'd figure it out," she said. What she hadn't told anyone, not Rowan, not Sterling, not Deja, was what had really kept her going through the worst months. It wasn't stubbornness exactly, though that was part of it. It was something more specific. The memory of Leland walking her around this ranch for the first time after the blindness came. His big patient hand on her shoulder, his voice naming every post and gate and water trough and pasture boundary, building the map she would later memorize. "You'll always know where you are," he told her. "You know this land. It won't leave you." She had built a horse on top of that foundation, on top of his patience. It seemed important that she understand that, not for credit, not for diminishment, but for honesty. She was not alone in this, even now. The documentary crew arrived in January. There were 5 of them, led by a director named Priscilla. No, not Priscilla, that name was on the list. Led by a director named Sarah, who was somewhere in her mid-30s and had the focused, slightly formal energy of someone accustomed to being underestimated. She shook Maisie's hand at the front gate and said, "I want to get this right. Tell me how to get it right." Maisie respected that immediately. They spent the first 2 days just following her through the ranch's daily routines, observing without intervening. On the 3rd day, Sarah asked if they could film the paddock work. "Yes," Maisie said, "but no sudden movements, no equipment sounds he hasn't heard before, and if he gets anxious, we stop." Understood. The cameras were small and quiet. Yolanda, who had come back as still photographer, had warned them. "She hears everything. Behave accordingly." What the documentary captured over the next 4 days became the film's central sequence, the one that, when it aired the following spring, made people stop scrolling. Maisie in the paddock with Ash, the 2 of them moving through what looked, to outside eyes, like a slow and private conversation, her hands reading his flanks, his head lowering by degrees until it rested on her shoulder with what could only be described as intention. But the moment everyone remembered, the clip that traveled furthest, that got played in a veterinary college classroom in Virginia, and a riding therapy center in Portugal, and on a phone screen at a gas station in rural Montana, was not the most visually beautiful one. It was a moment on day 3 of filming, unplanned and almost missed. Maisie had been walking Ash on a lead through the outside pasture. He'd advanced to that level, was moving with her in a way Sarah described in her notes as eerily harmonious, when the lead rope slipped. Maisie went still immediately, one hand in the air, instinct pausing everyone around her. Ash stopped. He stood there, free of the rope, no constraint, nothing between him and the open pasture, except his own will. 3 seconds passed. 5. Ash turned and pressed his forehead against Maisie's outstretched hand. She exhaled. The camera caught it from 40 feet away, a telephoto lens that made the moment feel both distant and terrifyingly intimate. This blind woman and this wild horse in an empty January pasture, making some agreement that the people watching could see but not fully read. "He chose her," Sarah wrote in her production notes, "completely voluntarily." That's the film. But the story wasn't done yet. Because 3 weeks after filming wrapped, the bank sent a notice. The loan modification Maisie had applied for 6 months earlier had been denied. The property was being placed in a formal collection process. She had 60 days. She sat with the letter. She'd had Rowan read it to her over the phone, both of them silent through most of it, and didn't say anything for a long time. "What do you want to do?" Rowan asked. "I want to keep the ranch. Then we need a lawyer, and we need money." "Yes." The documentary wasn't going to air for months. Sterling's article had brought attention, but attention and revenue weren't the same thing. The horse breeding inquiry that one caller had mentioned, the idea that Ash, once gentled, might be used in a gentling program for other at-risk horses, was real, but the timeline was long. Maisie spent 3 days thinking. On the 4th day, she called Deja. "The adoption program," she said. "Is there any structure for a horse to be formally used in therapeutic work, where the program gets involved, some kind of partnership?" Deja was quiet for a moment. "There's a pilot program with 3 sites in Texas. It's new. They're looking for a 4th. Another pause. "Maisie?" "I know," Maisie said. "Tell me what the application looks like." "You'd have to have the property assessed, and you'd have to demonstrate—" Deja stopped. "You'd have to demonstrate that the facility and the trainer are capable of working with difficult horses," Maisie finished. A long silence on the line. "Yes," Deja said very quietly. "I have a camera crew's worth of footage that shows exactly that," Maisie said, "and a published article, and a horse that a month ago nobody could touch, who now walks a lead with a blind woman in an open pasture." She paused. "Tell me who to call." The application was submitted on a Tuesday in February. It was reviewed by a 3-person committee. One of them, a horse behaviorist named Reeves, drove out to do a site visit. He spent 2 hours at the ranch, said almost nothing, wrote detailed notes in a small green notebook. He watched Maisie work Ash for 40 minutes from outside the fence. When she came out, he said, "In 30 years working with horses, I've seen maybe 4 people with what you have, and all 4 of them could see." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she just nodded and invited him in for coffee. The approval came 6 weeks later. Maisie was in the paddock when Rowan called with the news. She had one hand on Ash's neck. She spent a lot of time that way now, just resting, not working, just being near him. And she listened to Rowan's voice break apart with relief and joy on the other end of the line. The ranch had been given a contract, a real one, steady income, and a mandate to do exactly what she'd been doing, take the horses nobody else could reach and find a way through. She hung up the phone and stood in the paddock in the late winter afternoon, Ash warm and solid beside her, and felt the land under her feet the way she always felt it, the particular press of that red clay against her boots, the specific angle of the wind from the northwest, the sound the fence made when it was cold. You'll always know where you are. She knew where she was. Spring came in slowly that year, the way it does in that part of Texas. Not a clean arrival, but a long negotiation between cold and warmth, frost at night, and real heat by midday. The ranch changed with it. A small addition was built behind the barn, a gentling shed as they called it, with smooth rubber flooring and high ventilation and no sharp edges anywhere. The first new horse arrived in April, a bay mare named by the program as Number 61, who had been pulled from a feedlot situation and arrived in a state of compressed, silent terror that Maisie recognized immediately. She'd spent 40 minutes at the mare's gate that first day, just standing, breathing, talking about nothing. Rowan visited every 2 weeks now, and on one of those visits she stood at the fence watching her sister work and said very carefully, "I owe you an apology." For what?" Maisie asked. "For every time I thought you couldn't." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "You were scared for me," she said. "That's different. Not always. Not every time." A pause. "All right," Maisie said. "I'll take it." The documentary aired in May, on a Thursday night, on a streaming platform. Maisie had Rowan come over, and they sat on the porch with a radio on because Rowan didn't own a TV at the ranch. And Rowan narrated what she saw on her laptop, while Maisie listened. By Friday morning, there were 200 messages in the program's inquiry inbox. Sterling called to say the county paper had gotten more reader response to his original article from the reprint traffic than anything they'd run in 15 years. Deja drove out that weekend with a bottle of wine and a folder of program expansion proposals. The bank, after a quiet renegotiation that Maisie's new contract income had made possible, withdrew the collection notice. The modified loan closed in June. Ash was never sold, never lent out, never moved to another facility. He remained at the ranch. His role evolved. He became, in the program's documentation, the acclimation horse, the animal that new arrivals were placed near first, because something in his presence settled the other horses in a way the behaviorists noted but couldn't fully explain. He was the proof of concept. He was the precedent. He was, Maisie thought, simply himself. The same horse that had arrived in a reinforced trailer on a cold November morning, terrified and explosive, and misread by everyone who'd evaluated him. He hadn't changed exactly. He'd been understood. The following autumn, Maisie agreed to speak at a small horse welfare conference in San Antonio. She'd never done anything like it. Rowan drove her down and sat in the third row, and watched her sister walk to the podium in front of 200 people, veterinarians, trainers, program administrators, a few journalists. With the same even deliberateness, she walked every unfamiliar space, slowly, attentively, without apology. Someone helped her to the microphone. She stood there for a moment, both hands on the podium, and said nothing. In the crowd, a few people shifted. Then she began. She didn't talk about blindness first. She talked about the horse, about the moment she'd heard him in that trailer and known, not as a professional assessment, not as an expert judgment, but as a simple recognition that what was in there was not a dangerous animal but a frightened one. That fear and danger look the same from the outside, but feel completely different from within. She talked about the way silence could be an act of generosity, the way patience wasn't passive. It was the hardest active work she knew of, the way you cannot rush an animal or a person out of the place fear has put them. You can only make the space around them safe enough that they decide, on their own, to come forward. "I'm blind," she said about halfway through. "This is not something I recommend, but it taught me something I would not trade." She paused. "When you can't see, you stop performing. You stop managing how you appear. There's no point. And the moment you stop performing, animals know. They've always known. We're the ones who forgot." In the third row, Rowan was crying again. The same broken, laughing quality as before, that sound of relief that has been stored too long. Afterward, a young woman came up to Maisie, a trainer 19 or 20 years old, with a hesitant energy that reminded Maisie of Ash in those first days, and said, "I have a horse nobody else will work with. He's going to be put down next month if I can't find a place." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Yes, you do," Maisie said gently. The young woman, her name was Brecken, drove out to the ranch the following week. The horse came 3 weeks after that. He was a grey. Maisie stood at his gate the first morning and listened to him breathe. She waited. She heard him come closer. The ranch, that second autumn, had 4 horses in the gentling program, 2 full-time hands, a partnership with the state, and a waiting list. The east fence had been fully repaired. The well pump had been replaced. The bunkhouse had a new roof. The land looked to anyone who hadn't seen it before like a ranch that had always been this way. Steady, purposeful, rooted, the kind of place that had simply always been here. Only the people who knew the history understood what it had cost to keep it standing, and only one person understood what it had felt like to stand on it, blind and widowed, and past the point where any reasonable observer would have said, "Keep going," and to hear in the silence and the wind and the sound of a frightened horse settling, something that sounded like an answer. There's a specific kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have the shape we've been taught to recognize, the decisive gesture, the bold speech, the dramatic turning point. It looks like a woman standing at a fence for 40 minutes, talking about nothing, waiting. It looks like going back to the paddock the morning after you've been knocked down. It looks like a letter on the kitchen table that you don't throw away, because you're not done yet. Maisie Calloway didn't save her ranch by fighting. She saved it by being still enough, patient enough, present enough that the thing no one believed she could reach finally came to her. And a horse that had been written off as lost came with it. We talk a lot about second chances in stories like this, but I think what this really is, what Maisie and Ash really represent, is first chances being claimed late. Neither of them had ever been given a fair reading. They'd both been assessed by people who looked at the surface and stopped there. All they needed was one person to stay quiet long enough to hear what was actually underneath. If this story stayed with you, leave your city below. Hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Some stories need to be told. This was one of them.